Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this workshop entitled Why Identity Matters, African American Students in Black Racial Identity Development. My name is Dr. Angela Birts. I am the founder and CEO of Birts Equity and Inclusion Solutions. It's a diversity consulting firm that I started in 2018 to work with schools, nonprofit organizations, and corporations to help them expand their commitment to diversity and inclusion. A lot of the work that I do with my clients focuses on helping them to define what diversity and equity means for their sociocultural context, as well as developing a mission statement to drive the work that they do, objectives, creating task force to carry out that work, and then also thinking of initiatives that will continue to spearhead that work within their organization. Initiatives can include developing race-based affinity groups to give people from different backgrounds to unpack their personal experience within the system, but other opportunities might include workshops and training on a range of topics. Thank you for joining me today. I will begin by talking about my personal experience, which is the catalyst for my interest in the topic of racial identity development, as well as issues of race and social justice and diversity altogether. So I come from East Palo Alto. I'm a Bay Area native. I spent my early childhood living in the Light Tree Apartments, which are low-income government housing. It's one of the few apartment complexes that still exist in East Palo Alto after gentrification. So growing up in the Light Tree Apartments, I was in an environment where I was immersed with individuals, students, and families that came from a wide range of backgrounds, which isn't unique to the city of East Palo Alto. But those backgrounds that my friends belonged to were Hispanic and Mexican American, Fijian, Black, as well as other racial and ethnic backgrounds. I was also an individual who started school relatively early. I attended the Head Start program in East Menlo Park where my grandparents lived. So I spent a majority of my childhood maneuvering between the city of East Palo Alto and East Menlo Park. And as a student in the early childhood development stages, I was a preschool student who really enjoyed school, and I felt that the Head Start program at that age did adequately prepare me for kindergarten. So my journey in public school began in the Ravenswood City School District. I started off at Brentwood Academy, and then from there I attended a few other schools within the district. An interesting aspect of my story, I would say, that made my early journey in education quite unique is that when I was in the 5th grade, a student at Ronald McNair, I was asked to participate in a program that was to enrich and challenge me as a student because I was someone that was deemed as talented, but I was also someone that was deemed as gifted, along with roughly 30 or 40 other students in the middle school that I attended, which at the time had a huge population or students who did experience teenage pregnancy earlier on, and as well as other issues related to living in a social disadvantaged neighborhood. And so for me, the opportunity to attend a special program or a unique program to focus on my studies was something that I very much look forward to in 5th grade. And so as a result, at the end of the first semester of my 5th grade year, I did join the program where I left the school with some of my peers, and we started to attend classes at the district office as a part of the experiment, as a part of the pilot program that the district put forth to wrestle with what do you do with students who are learning at a fast rate and could benefit from more rigor. And so I attended classes there, and I did feel challenged academically. From there, this is all within my 5th grade year. After a few months, I made the switch to another school within the Ravenswood School District, Greens Oaks Academy. And similarly, I took other rigorous classes. And by the end of my 5th grade year, I transferred to Menlo Oaks, a part of the same district. So within my 5th grade year, I attended 3 different schools. And that really was the district way of trying to reconcile creating opportunities for students within the school district while also addressing the social, emotional, and academic needs of other students who also needed a special type of support. That part of my journey was really important for me because those were the fondest memories in which I really felt comfortable, affirmed in being a young Black girl in East Palo Alto. and that a majority of my teachers were African Americans. And I recognize that that's not a statement that some people can say, but I'm quite fortunate that I had those experiences with my teacher and that I still am in contact with some of those teachers, one of them being Marlene Davis, who is now retired, but most recently she did serve as a principal at a school in Fremont, California. She was my homeroom teacher in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, and she very much invested in me as a learner and, in fact, taught me how to memorize and also signed me up to compete and give speeches and so forth, which has helped me to this day. But a shift happened in my life as a learner and as a student that impacted the way I saw myself racially and even socially. I was afforded an opportunity to attend private school for high school, in which I made the decision to transition out of public schools to receive a private school education. It was something that was presented to me in a way that was appealing as a young person. The classroom sizes would be smaller, and then also I would definitely have an opportunity to go to college. And I was on board for that. What I wasn't prepared for, however, was how I would feel and how differently I was treated because of my racial ethnic background, as well as the fact that I came from the city of East Palo Alto, in which people had a lot of negative stereotypes and connotations about. So I grapple with my identity. I grappled with fitting in. I grapple with coming from a socioeconomic status that was deemed disadvantaged, low income, or poor. And overall, it challenged me to think about how I saw myself. I won't go into very many details about that experience, but what I will say is that defining moment of my life where I was forced to think about all the things I was lacking in my private school experience that I had in my public school experience that I didn't realize at the time was affirming and actually a positive experience for me, has led me to do the work that I'm doing now. And so when I graduated from San Jose State University in 2017, I focused my dissertation study on the racial identity development of African American students. And so this presentation is about the topic as well as other themes related to racial identity development. So thank you for listening to my story. So this session focuses on race and Black racial identity development of African American students and what research tells us about race consciousness in children and youth. As we all know, the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd, among others, have placed a spotlight on racism nationally and globally. Many people across the nation are wondering how to discuss race and racism with kids, students, and adults. Depending on your own race, you may or may not feel adept to discuss race, or perhaps you have been discussing race all along. For many families, the talk on race happens with their children from an early age, and this is especially true for Black families who do not have the option to opt out of conversations about race, racism, and inequality. Whereas families of color discuss race explicitly, other families uphold the idea that children don't see color. And they might raise their children with the belief that skin color doesn't matter and that it is the inside that counts, a process known as color blindness. However, research shows us even infants notice race. The truth is, kids will pick up information about race wherever they see fit. Today, we are going to explore this further. Our goals for this session are threefold. First, to define race, Black racial identity development, and other related terminology, to build an understanding of racial identity development among African American students and African American individuals in general. Practice having honest, objective, and supportive conversations to become better advocates for African American students. I do have norms for this session, and these norms are particularly helpful where there are opportunities to have conversations. So I am going to imagine that we are in discussion with each other today, though I cannot see you all. So one of my norms is for all of us to be present. I ask that you all listen to understand versus listen to respond, to accept the speaker's viewpoint as true for him or her, use I statements And I will model that throughout this presentation as I've started in talking about my personal experience and lean into discomfort. This is a topic that people might not feel comfortable discussing or might not have safe places to discuss. So I hope that you can see this as a safe place to have a conversation around race. As a warm-up, I pose 3 questions for you all. First, I want you to think about how old were you when you first recognized the concept of race? And that could be an awareness of skin tone differences or racial differences themselves. I also want you to ask yourself, how comfortable are you discussing race? And how often do you discuss race? Paramount to this discussion are the definitions and understandings of 2 well-known concepts. The first concept is race. Race defined as a social construct that is attached to a variety of physical attributes, including but not limited to skin and eye color, hair texture, and bone structures of people in the US and beyond. I mentioned the word social construct. Another way to look at that term is through a concept as social constructionism, which is a theory of knowledge and sociology that posits that constructed understandings of the world form the basis for shared assumptions about reality. So what does this concept of race tell us about society, or how does it shape how people view others? The concept of race and race itself in the US has been used mostly and served to justify inequitable, often inhumane treatment of some population by others, such as the forced removal and genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of Africans. Racial groups also differ across socio-cultural contexts and geographies, in that how one identifies racially may differ from how one is perceived. And we'll talk more about that when we delve into the topic of racial identity development. Racism is a system of advantage based on race, perpetuated through institutions, policies, practices, ideologies, and interpersonal interactions designed to benefit people perceived as white and to disadvantage those perceived as people of color in the US. Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum, a psychologist and scholar who has conducted extensive research and written books on the topic of racism, argues in her 1994 study, it is virtually impossible to live in the US contemporary society and not be exposed to some aspect of the personal, cultural, and/or institutional manifestations of racism in society. It is also assumed that, as a result, all of us have received some misinformation about those groups disadvantaged by racism. I also want to note, as I reflected on my experience belonging to both a public school system and a private school system, I was privy of Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum's work at a young age, because she wrote a book entitled, "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" And that definitely is a conversation that I was a part of in high school, in terms of having to justify why I chose to hang with other students of color, as there weren't very many Black students, on a regular basis, because it made me feel comfortable. But I mentioned that book to say, I understood that title, and I understood her intentionality with creating some space to talk about how youth unpack race, because I was one of those type of youth along with my peers. But what we can take away from Dr. Tatum's argument is that one must consciously be aware of race and messages espoused about different groups. So I pose another set of questions for everyone today. What are some of the early messages you received from your family and community about racial differences? How did those messages make you feel? How did those messages impact your perception of self and others? Answering those questions could be useful through adopting a concept known as racial awareness or race consciousness. So race consciousness. is when you are aware of race and the pervasiveness of racism and oppression in society. For Black youth in particular, race consciousness includes their own race, personal experience with racism, and discussions they receive on the topic of race. That is racial socialization. We're all socialized to think about this concept of race. I mentioned earlier that some people do not have the privilege of opting out of conversations related to race. And so I could speak from my personal experience and say that I had discussions about race as early as the age of 4. Fortunately, mine wasn't predicated on a negative experience. It had everything to do with my curiosity about my friends in the apartment complex where I live and my desire to want to know why they looked different, why their family structure was different, and what did that mean for me as a person. And my mom created some language and some tools for me to understand people come from different racial ethnic backgrounds. Individuals could be multi-ethnic and multiracial, but my responsibility as a person is to honor their experience and treat them with respect. And so this topic of racial socialization is really the underpinning of how Black children in particular begin to wrestle or understand the concept of race. Those with race consciousness can begin to address racism because they have a cognitive understanding of the continued existence of race-based privilege and oppression. But what about those without this awareness? Individuals who might deny or minimize the continuing influence of racism in our reality. That's not to say that people cannot arrive at having conversations as they become older, but it is to say that our upbringings very much impact our comfortability and understanding on how to have those conversations, particularly across lines of difference when we want to be effective in sharing our experience with others who do not look like us or come from the same background. So we're going to transition to this concept of Black racial identity development. I'm sure you all have heard the term identity before. When I worked at a high school, I taught a class on identity. And the best way that I would describe it to students is to say, identity is a term used throughout the social sciences to answer the question, who am I? Not only does it answer the question, who am I, but it demonstrates one's beliefs, ideals, and values. So we all have identity, and there's intersectionality between our identities. Today, we're focused on the topic of race, but race isn't in a vacuum. Just as much as one could have a racial identity, socioeconomic status is a part of identity, gender is a part of identity, religion is a part of identity. So I want to emphasize that message that when we're having these conversations, the conversation around Black racial identity development, and as I speak to my experience and other student experiences, that all those experiences with race intersect with other aspects of their identities that students can define for themselves as you get to know them and as they have the language to share their experiences with you. But as we think about the topic of Black racial identity development, simply put, it is how a person grows, how a Black grows to include their Black identity in their self-concept. So think about becoming Black or becoming a particular racial group. And it's not just about becoming Black or being aware that you're Black. It's about developing a healthy self-concept to where the salience of race and the salience of being Black for some people supersede other aspects of their identity because we live in a racialized society. Black racial identity development theory comes out of research, psychology research in the 1970s. A theorist and a researcher in the field of ethnic identity development, William Cross, and his colleagues introduced the concept of Black racial identity development, as well as nigrescence, which is a model that outlined the stages of individual Black consciousness development during the Black Power movement of the late 1960s. It is peer-reviewed psychological research. Over time, the model has been expanded into a comprehensive theory, including 8 exemplars, which can be broken down to 6. And these 6 are the ones that I'll focus on the next slide. But this concept was revised in 1991 and again in 2000. There's also other versions of the racial identity development that's not just for Black individuals, but there's an Asian identity development. There's a white identity development. There's a multi-ethnic identity development that's used in psychological research. This theory is useful in today's society. It is a vehicle for examining the beliefs of African American children. It acknowledges the transition from middle school to high school catalyzes the identity development of adolescents. And it also recognizes that African American youth have a keen sense of awareness about their race. So I mentioned that there are 5 stages that I want to walk everyone through for today. The very first stage, according to the research, is an idea of a precounter. And the precounter is when an individual identifies with white culture, rejects or even denies membership in Black culture. But there is research aligned to this precounter that we might not think about often. And that is, what does this mean for a child that's in their early stages of development? So I want to point your attention to some early research related to the precounter stage, as well as how babies function and process race. So you all may have heard of Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark. So they're African-American psychologists who, as a married team, conducted research among children and were active in the civil rights movement. They conducted a study entitled Emotional Factors in Racial Identification and Preference in Negro Children. The study was published in the Journal of Negro Education before appearing before the court during Brown versus the Board of Education of 1954. So the study was of a doll experiment in which children were presented with 2 dolls. These were Black children. Both of these dolls were completely identical, except for the skin and hair color. One doll was white with yellow hair, while the other was brown with Black hair. The child was then asked, inquiring about which one is the doll they would play with, which one is the nice doll, which one looks bad, and which one has the nicer hair color. The experiment showed a clear preference for the white doll among all children in the study. One of the study's conclusion is that a Black child by the age of 5 is aware that to be a person of color in America also means to have an inferior status. These findings expose internalized racism among children, which as a child develop can turn into a form of self-hatred. Particularly for kids who attend segregated schools. This particular research paved the way for an increase in psychological research in the areas of self-esteem and self-concept. Not everyone accepted the doll test, just like not everyone accepted racial identity development. But I use it here today because it does hold some truth and relevance to what a person can undergo and think about as they develop their self-concept. So that's the pre-counter stage. So simply put, with the pre-counter stage, it's a child's preference for whiteness or preference for something outside of their racial ethnic group. Stage 2 is around the encounter stage. And this happens with an encounter that an individual has around race that can impact their experience in a social cultural context and also their understanding of what it means to belong. So example of that could be when a child is called the N-word for the first time, or when a child is excluded from an activity because of their race, or when a child is repeatedly not called on because of their race. Even at a young age, a child could notice that difference and associate that having a Black identity doesn't feel like a positive thing in the situation that they're in. And it could cause anxiety, psychological discomfort, but also an understanding of social conformity, who matters, what group and representation of different groups carries weight in a particular environment. All of that could come about with an encounter that a student has. And I talked about my encounters, my positive encounters earlier on with race, and then later my encounters in a negative way with not feeling like I belonged. This third stage is immersion. So this happens simultaneously. And this is when an individual completely identifies with Black culture and also has an understanding of different symbols and artifacts that represent the particular culture. So for a Black individual, this could mean reading books on Black revolutionaries and leaders. It could also mean identifying with pro-Black images and expressions and sayings such as, I'm Black and I'm proud. I grew up in a household where my parents listened to James Brown, so I knew earlier on that I'm Black and I'm proud, and that's a song, that's a positive part of my childhood identity. For a student in high school, it can mean that they choose to join a Black student union group. And in that particular group, that is where they could find an affinity and a liking with other people in that space. But there are two parts to this stage, the immersion and then immersion. And so with the immersion that's being surrounded by Blackness, for some individuals, they can develop an anti-white and an intense Black involvement. The immersion stage is the rational understanding of identity itself. A person can become fixated on either stage, depending on how much time they spend in Black culture and the lack of exposure of having those conversations with other people, even if it is people within the same racial ethnic group who might have a different aspect of their identity in addition to just belonging to the Black race. The fourth stage is internalization. And this is when an individual internalizes Black culture to an extent where they transcend racism in their mind. So I mentioned a person could have, in the earlier stage, a person could have a preference for Black artifacts, but it's more than that. It's also being open to having the conversation around what it means to be Black in a positive way, to where there's pride associated with that. And also where there's a curiosity and a desire to learn more and more about what it means to be immersed in Black culture. The last stage, this is internalization commitment. And this is where an individual feels committed to helping other people who might grapple with what it means to be Black, or who might struggle with their identity based on the environment that they're in, or an encounter that they've had, or overall just their predicament around forming a healthy self-concept. And so a person in this stage might run for a leadership position. For a child, it could be that they run to become the president of a race-based cultural club or cultural affinity group. Other people might turn to the internet and write blogs about their experience. The experience not limited to just the race of being Black in terms of how you look and how your hair. It could also be what it means to live in a neighborhood or a community that's being gentrified. What does it mean to live in poverty? What does it mean to be a first-generation college student? The topics can vary for someone in this stage, but they really do leverage different resources and different platforms to talk about what it means to be Black. So those are the different stages there. And I will reference them throughout the remainder of our presentation, but I wanted to shed light on this form of research. I posed two other questions for you. How would you describe your current stage of racial identity development? And what is a challenge or a question you are wrestling with? And that's based on what you've heard. The next set of research that I'll focus on is going to start with infancy up until high school, to delve more into this preference that children have for their racial ethnic group or for another racial ethnic group. So how and when do children begin to demonstrate a concept known as implicit intergroup preferences, which simply mean a preference towards someone of your group? Well, in a study entitled The Development of Implicit Intergroup Cognition, the researchers argue that by age 5, Black children in research settings show no preference toward their own groups compared to whites. However, white children at this stage remain strongly biased in favor of whiteness. And another part of this sample revealed that Hispanic children show in-group preference when comparing their groups to Black Americans. There's another study in which young children, took the implicit association test. And some of you might be aware of this test that comes out of Harvard, but it is a test in which an individual is tested on their biases. This particular test examined racial attitudes. White 6-year-olds in the US showed implicit in-group preference at levels statistically identical to white American adults, meaning that at a very, very young age, children adopted this idea that belonging to a racial ethnic group that has privilege and that is assumed to have a superiority is something that is considered a positive thing, but also something that's considered a preference to want to continue to belong to that particular group. How do these evaluations change over the lifespan? And what are the crucial inputs that drive this change? So I want to talk more about this preference for babies, because we might not think about that often. So I mentioned 5-year-olds, but what was going on for those 5-year-olds when they were babies? An infant has a preference for a particular face configuration that is known in psychology and in science. They look at particular patterns. They start to figure out and determine who's attractive and who's unattractive based on the facial configurations of an individual. And infants also prefer to look at the face and hear the voice of their primary caregiver, prefer the sound of their native language, and prefer women's faces, and prefer racial in-group members. So associating the faces that they see as a part of a racial ethnic group is something that's happening for a baby, according to psychology and according to this report. Children from racial and ethnic groups that are socially advantaged show robust implicit preference for their in-group, as I mentioned. I mentioned the implicit association test, and this is an illustration of the study in which the white 6-year-olds were giving images on the screen and were asked to click on a particular image. So in the first critical block, children categorize Black faces and negative words by using a single left response button, and white faces and positive words using a single right response button. And on the right picture, the opposite was in effect. So conceptually, the assumption is that preferred groups will be paired more rapidly and more accurately with positive attributes. So if you're a child and have a preference for a particular racial group, you associate that racial group with positive attributes. Conversely, you associate someone that's not a part of that racial group with negative attributes. So again, this is the psychology behind younger children and their associations with race. There's another article that I'll briefly discuss that poses a question. Are children adopting the negative attitudes that adults promote, particularly when it comes to politics, particularly when it comes to the messages in the news, particularly when it comes to conversations that students and children listen in on when adults are talking about others of racial ethnic groups? This study contends that by kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes as adults, and they also learn to associate certain groups with higher status to have more positive values. What this article found, another article found, is that talking about entire groups of people as being threatening or dangerous, or speaking to other groups in demeaning ways, and this article particularly did address Donald Trump earlier comments when he was running for office. And they argue that this is a type of language that children are likely to internalize. And I do believe that. And I have seen that children do internalize messages about themselves and about other racial ethnic groups when they hear them and see them in the media, as well as in their interactions with other adults that they trust. And the last study that I'll focus on is really important as it relates to the racial socialization process, meaning how individuals are socialized to think about race. So in one particular study, participants were asked to think about their interracial friendship group. Now, though these participants were of white descent, there is another part of this study that shed some light on young students' perception about members of the Black race in particularly. So there were two questions that the researchers posed to these young children. And one was, how many white people are nice? Almost all, a lot, some, not, many, or none were the choices that the students could select. And how many Black people are nice? That was another question that they posed. And what they found is that, again, those positive racial attitudes were associated with members of a high status race or white individuals. And what parents say depends heavily on their own race. Another aspect of this study is that they gave the participants and their families a set of modules to take home and work on. And in one of those modules, they included an episode of Sesame Street in which the characters, as you see reflected there, were invited to visit an African-American family where they were able to see the racial socialization process at play and positive images of Black individuals. And the goal was to see, would that impact or change how these families thought about individuals who come from a racial ethnic background. And the unfortunate part about this particular study is that many of the families dropped out and did not continue to partake in the study, impacting the results. This slide has this video that is hyperlinked in the PowerPoint presentation attached to the online platform. I talked about the racial socialization process, and this is particularly for African American students now. And the implicit and implicit messages that African American adolescent students encounter from their parents, for example, is known as racial socialization. So you learn things based on your family and your parents, as I've said, and it's in your families that you learn about societal oppression. It's also in your families that you learn about what it means to have a positive heritage. And that's from my own research and my own study on racial identity development. But the teenage years are extremely important for Black youth because that keen sense of racial consciousness that they have also lends itself to questions about who am I racially, but also what is my relationship to my ethnic racial group and membership. And this happens particularly in predominantly white schools. That could be public schools. It could be a parochial school. It could also be a charter school. As I gave a presentation earlier for the Ways to Equity Playbook, and I emphasized the dwindling percentage of African Americans in the state of California, but also how that impacts the school age population in our California schools. So when I mentioned this idea of a predominantly white environment or an environment where African American students are not a part of the majority, that is a reality that a lot of the students are experiencing and facing now in California. A study related to the experience of African American students found that when individuals are in high school, they do develop friendships. And oftentimes they develop friendships along the lines of their racial ethnic group and their background. And I talked about this in my study, but this particular study is useful in that cross-race friends tend to share a single activity. As a result, these friendships are more likely to be lost over time as children transition from middle school or high school. So in a nutshell, 85% of Black students in this study were friends with Black individuals. And the odds of a white high schooler in America having a best friend of another race is only 8%. So it is in schools where students have a peer group association where they relate to people of their same background. And then they also form those friendships, which challenges me as an educator often to think about my role of facilitating conversations in spaces where students can have meaningful experiences and positive experiences with students and families from other racial ethnic groups. Why does all of this matter? Because young children notice race as early in infancy, in early childhood development. We talked about that at the age 5, in adolescence, and so forth. Also, there is an overarching assumption or even thought of if you were to talk about race with a young child, that it can encourage or incite some sort of racial bias in a child. But research suggests that that isn't true. In fact, a silence and not talking about race reinforces racism. The desire to talk about race and racism is pronounced during adolescence for African American students who have a keen sense of racial awareness and race consciousness. So parents, teachers, and mentors can play an influential role in helping students of all ages develop positive attitudes about race. Here are some questions when you obtain the copy of these slides for you to think about in your context, such as what are the opportunities to participate in open and honest conversations about race and racism? A lot of people would just say, how can we have courageous conversations about race in K through 12 schools, referencing Glenn Singleton's work? How can we view culture, heritage, and race as resources in our profession? To what extent do efforts to address Black racial identity development education depend on us attaining educational equity? I want to offer you some guidance on how to facilitate that process for yourself, but also facilitate it for students. So as an adult, have courageous conversations on race with adults and other educators. That is an opportunity for you to talk about how you see race play out in your personal life or how you see it play out in your professional life. Often there is assumption that a training or a workshop can dismantle a lot of the issues that we see around race, or that a concept could do it. But what I know from personal experience, that this is really an inside out approach to doing work, that we have to start with ourselves as individuals and spend some time reflecting on how the topic of race and the experience of racism in this country has impacted us personally, to better prepare us to have the conversation with others, and to better prepare us to be aware on the appropriate and effective strategies and techniques on how to lead the conversation with vulnerable students and young adults who, though vulnerable by their age and developmentally, very much do have these conversations in their spare times and in their spaces at a very high rate. You can take the implicit association test for yourself and figure out what are some of your biases around race and other related topics. Another thing that you can do if you are in a school or if you're in an organization is that you can organize I'll go to number 4. That's in different organizations and schools. But as an adult, you can organize an age-appropriate conversation with children to find out what they know about race. You could ask children what they know about different racial and ethnic groups in terms of their experiences. Another strategy is that you can develop or support race-based affinity groups, such as a Black Student Union. That the concept of a race-based affinity group takes on different definitions and different meanings depending on the context. So in a school, it's appropriate to call it a race-based affinity group. If it's a Black Student Union, that might also be a Latinos Unidos club. If you take the race-based component out of it, an affinity group itself, where students come together who have a similar background, can be a group for LGBTQ students as well, such as a spectrum club. It can be for students of a religious group, but the focus here is on race-based affinity groups. And for a Black Student Union, there should always be a goal in developing these type of groups, both for adults and for students themselves. Some objectives that I've used in my research and in my work in working with different school districts are the following. The goal should be to build community among their members, identify common issues that different members face, share successes in members' environment. What does it mean to thrive in an environment if you are a Black student? What works for you and what doesn't work for you? It is very helpful for young people to have those conversations together, to learn from each other, but also to hold space for one another. A Black Student Union group and an affinity group also should promote ideas for action, provide opportunities for affirmation and celebration, and prepare for deep and honest cross-cultural dialogue with other affinity groups. I cannot emphasize enough how valuable it is to be able to talk about yourself and your racial identity with other people. I don't believe that it's something that should be forced. I do believe that if it is voluntary for students, I do believe that there should be objectives and parameters in place. But if it is a strategic initiative to create courageous conversations for young people, there should be norms in place similar to the norms that I talked about earlier. This idea of speaking from the I perspective or accepting the person's viewpoint as true for him or her. All of this work boils down to education. And with education, just like a teacher enters the classroom with a lesson plan, with objectives and with curriculum, such is the case for this work that we'll do with race for students. We should have a lesson in place. We should have very clear objectives about what we're asking of the students and what's expected of them. And they should know where they are and where we're trying to take them as adults. I believe that process should be very transparent, and it should be honest and something that's expressed before soliciting the involvement and voluntary participation of young people. They have a right to know what's expected of them and what are the goals for the work that an adult will do with them as it relates to their race and their background. And it's a really great way to model for young leaders and also help young leaders hone their leadership skills in terms of teaching them as well to develop plans and develop objectives as they want to focus on race-related topics and confront issues of racism in their schools and in their different organizations that they might belong to as young people. I've provided some resources here that could further the development of addressing race. I spoke a lot about young children, so I do have some books and videos for children on race, such as Let's Talk About Race, Anti-Racist Baby, Hair Love. That is a video that won, and I believe it was an Emmy or some type of award, but it did very well in terms of a young child getting her hair combed by her father and the experience of growing up in your family and getting your hair combed as a young Black girl, which I definitely can relate to. But these are all resources that are developmentally and age appropriate. Other resources are books for youth on race, like The Hate U Give. There's also an adaptation of that book, but it's a really good book on race. Mexican White Boy, Dare Martin is another book, and Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. This is the young adult version of the novel that he wrote, which also has an adaptation, a movie adaptation. I provided additional books and articles for adults on race. I mentioned Just Mercy. This is the adult version of it, How to Be an Anti-Racist. There's the baby version, the book for young children, but there's also ones for adults. I talked about Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? You might note the publication date, 2017. However, the original publication was in the 1990s. But in 2017, Dr. Beverly Daniel Tatum celebrated her, I believe it was her 20th or 25th year anniversary, in which she rewrote the prologue to address the systemic oppression and the police brutality that Blacks have faced in this country. So it's more references to the times that we're living in, while also including a lot of work and theory around racial identity development. Another book, I'm Chocolate, You're Vanilla, Raising Healthy Black and Biracial Children in a Race Consciousness World. Those are some other resources there. And there are resources for educators and parents on race. Teaching Tolerance has many different resources you could use on race. It's not limited to race. I mentioned intersectionality, the idea that our identities intersect with our racial identity intersect with other identities that we have. So Teaching Tolerance is good for getting information and resources for educators on race, as well as other topics related to identity. Culturally responsive education is also an approach to take in talking about the topic of race. And this particular study on culturally responsive self-care practices for early childhood educators is useful. And then an episode of NPR on talking race with young children. So those are my references there, and that concludes my presentation. Thank you.